Timber. Is it a game changer for climate action in building industry? Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and this is the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about urbanism, architecture, cities and many more. And in today's episode, we will talk about the intersection of sustainable construction and climate action. We have a special collaboration with Urban Future Conference and Laudas Foundation, which is Urban Future's partner. Urban Future is a leading international event focused on sustainable urban development and innovation. It serves as a platform for experts, policymakers, entrepreneurs, thought leaders and urban changemakers to come across and discuss solutions for creating more sustainable and livable cities. I've been the media partner of Urban Future last year in Helsingborg, and this year the conference will take place in Stuttgart, in Germany, between 21st and 23rd of June. I hope to see you there. This episode is made also as a collaboration with Laudas Foundation, which is an organization focused on driving the transition to more just and sustainable economy. Laudas Foundation is responding to the dual crisis of inequality and climate change by supporting brave, innovative efforts that inspire and challenge industry to harness its power for good. One of such initiatives is Built by Nature, which is an organization that focuses on facilitating collaboration and driving transformation in the construction industry towards nature-based solutions. My guest today is Joe Giddings, a passionate advocate for decarbonizing the built environment and the UK network's lead at Built by Nature. We'll talk about Joe's experience and the transition from being trained as an architect and working as an architect to becoming this advocate for more sustainable construction. In this episode, we'll dive into the crucial role of timber in sustainable construction and its potential to mitigate climate change. Joe will share insights on the benefits and challenges of timber construction. Now, let's get started with our conversation on the role of timber in sustainable construction with Joe Giddings from the Built by Nature network.
Yeah, I'm happy that you are joining me here from the UK, but actually you have a lot in common with Denmark. So Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm happy that you've been here in Copenhagen for some time and you know the context of the city. However, I don't think that Copenhagen will be the main topic of our discussion. I would like to explore the topic of wood construction and timber construction and building by nature, especially in the UK context. And I think that it would be amazing if we could start with sharing your story because you are trained as an architect. You've been also getting your education here at KADK, the Royal Danish Academy for the Design. But over the time, you switched more towards the sustainable construction, building with nature, building by nature as well. So could you just tell me and the listeners, how did your journey into sustainable construction start?
Yes, sure. And that's correct. I lived in Copenhagen for 3 years whilst I was studying for my master's in architecture. I was studying at KADK, like you pointed out, and the specific course that I was on was called Political Architecture, Critical Sustainability. So it was looking at how architecture mediates between people, how it is political, and particularly looking at, I suppose, supply chains or places in the world where the issues are particularly acute. So we actually studied Japan, post-tsunami reconstruction in Japan, and also Bangladesh as well. So looking at a rapidly urbanizing situation in Chittagong, which is the second biggest city in Bangladesh. But following that, I moved back to the UK and worked in London for a number of years as an architect, practicing for 2 medium-sized practices here in London, predominantly working on housing, designing housing around London and the southeast. During that time, awareness of climate change was increasing, and myself and a group of other architects in 2019 responded to the climate raising up the agenda and felt that there was a need for a coordinated network of architects, individuals within architecture and related professions to come together to take action collectively to respond to climate change. And so in 2019, during the summer of 2019, a group of about 7 to 10 of us kind of founded this network, the Architects Climate Action Network. And it really took off over the following couple of years. We expanded into a network of hundreds and thousands, actually, of architects across the UK, but also across Europe as well. And ACAN is still going today. And it was really through ACAN that I began to do a lot more work about decarbonizing construction, and with a particular focus on embodied carbon, raising awareness of embodied carbon and highlighting how it can be reduced, both to architects, but also by governments as well. And that led me into research that was really about timber specifically, and about timber buildings and the potential impacts that adopting timber on a widespread scale can have in reducing the embodied carbon of our new buildings. So I did a kind of year's worth of research with the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, which was looking specifically at mass timber, the challenges around adopting mass timber, and identifying potential solutions as well, like how can we overcome these challenges collectively at a systemic level. And that really led into my role at Built by Nature. So about a year ago, I joined Built by Nature and continued that work really. And that's where I am now.
Everything started with ACAN, with so-called Architects Climate Action Network. And I would just like to explore that a bit more. What was this stimuli that make you create this network? Because you've mentioned that the awareness was rising within the built industry, within architecture, of the climate change, the climate challenge, and how should we face that, especially as designers and architects. But was there something inside you, like this inner voice telling you that you maybe should explore that path, or wasn't something else?
Yes, there was, I suppose, a shared feeling between me and a group of others, like I'd said. We were looking around at what was happening within architecture and construction, or more specifically, what wasn't happening, actually. There was a shared frustration with the lack of change within the architecture profession and with the way that buildings are built. Along with the shared frustration, there was a slight feeling of disillusionment, because we felt at that time that the impacts that you can have as an individual within practice was nothing compared to the collective impacts that we could have if we stepped outside of our silos, our kind of professional silos, and acted as citizens. So citizens with a shared professional background and expertise in buildings, how they're designed and how the impacts that they have. And if we use that power, that collective power that we could form, we could then change the way that buildings are built across the system. So we're really looking at changing the entire system rather than small individual changes that you could make on projects. We were looking at those bigger barriers, really, the policy barriers, regulations that don't exist. So embodied carbon, for instance, isn't regulated in the UK. And we felt that it should be. So we felt that we could have a stronger voice by forming a collective action network than we could within practice.
Now, when everything is a bit more established and you are working towards the decarbonization of the UK's built environment sector, I think that things are maybe a bit easier. Of course, with still a lot of challenges, but thinking of this big change that you've made, weren't you afraid that you are challenging the status quo, the years or maybe even decades of business as usual, with tall buildings being made without people thinking about it, if it's climate friendly or not? So in other words, weren't you afraid that maybe you are just, closing some career path for yourself by challenging that?
No, not really. We weren't really afraid. I think we felt that there was a need for much stronger action. And actually, the whole idea was to change the status quo, the business as usual. We felt that we cannot go on constructing buildings the way that we are. And I think we all still feel that really strongly. Everything's changed really in the 4 years since we first formed Architects Climate Action Network. But now there is a much greater awareness amongst professions right across the sector that change needs to happen and that we need to take action.
What would you say is the first step towards the built environment to realize that the change is needed?
I think that back in 2019, there were many climate organizations forming, and there were widespread public protests, both by activist groups like Extinction Rebellion, but also by the school strikes, which were led infamously by Greta Thunberg, but took place all around the world. These events really put the climate crisis into the public eye, and they were responding themselves to the IPCC's last report at that time, the one that came out in 2018, which really put into sharp focus the scale of the crisis and the scale of change that's needed. So the climate emergency really raised up the agenda in 2019, and alongside ACAN, other industry networks were forming or strengthening around that time as well. So in the UK, we also had Architects Declare, which became a kind of global movement and is still going today. And we also had groups like LETI, which is the London Energy Transformation Initiative, which are doing work around operational energy use and embodied carbon as well. But those two networks were expanding massively at the same time, bringing in engineers as well as developers and construction firms. So it was really, I think, the work of many organizations and networks that meant that the climate went up the agenda in the built environment. And now we're at a point, I think, where developers, investors, architects, engineers, everybody across the supply chain really recognizes the need to change and is working collaboratively towards that. And the work that we're doing at Built by Nature is to try and bring together a more multi-stakeholder, cross-disciplinary network to really drive that change home.
So what would be the usual action taken by Built by Nature? Is that more of a facilitator? So you are having a network of different players that you've mentioned. It's developers, it's also designers, so maybe suppliers as well. And how would you act with them towards changing the environment, the built environment especially?
Yeah, Built by Nature is a network on the one hand, and it's also a grant-making organization on the other. So we are a mission-driven organization with a goal to increase the use of timber and other bio-based materials in construction. And this mission, I suppose, is guided then by an overarching vision, which is for a built environment that works in closer unison with nature, but specifically thinking through the prism of materials that we use in construction. So our network brings together demand-side stakeholders. We're specifically looking to stimulate demand for timber and bio-based products. And we do that by identifying the challenges, the primary challenges that are preventing widespread adoption of these materials, and identifying solutions to overcome those things. And then funding or enabling those solutions through our network, through our grant fund. So our network brings in a diverse range of stakeholders such as developers, insurers, architects, engineers, and other designers such as fire consultants, who are very important as well. Also brings in cities and investors as well. So we want to bring all of those kind of key big six stakeholders on the demand side together to collectively understand what the challenges are, what are the main challenges that are stopping massive timber buildings being built in countries across Europe, and then identifying solutions and funding those.
And how far down the road are you right now if you compare to a couple of years ago? I'm asking because on your website, I think it was, I found this very interesting statement of yours that the industry is not responding effectively to the climate crisis. And that was this huge, huge challenge that you had, I think that when you were applying to RIBA, and that was one of your key statements. Do you think that this proceeded anyhow if you compare with today?
Yes, that's a good question. I think we're definitely making progress, but I think much of the progress that's been made to date has been about awareness being a greater awareness of the risks and the impacts that we have in the way that we build. I think that we predominantly at Built by Nature, we're working with large organizations such as Lend-Lease, a kind of major developer that builds large and complex buildings all around the world. And we're working with developers such as Lend-Lease to identify how we can adopt timber on these large and complex developments. So large commercial buildings, large residential buildings. And I think these are the types of building where we can have the greatest impact. And that's really because, for a number of reasons, but primarily it's because the climate crisis necessitates that we predominantly develop urban areas, right? We need to be building dense urban environments at scale so that people can live and work in places where there are public transport links. And so throughout this century, the primary way that we should be building is this kind of dense mid to high rise urban development, I believe. If we're looking at the buildings then, at the building scale, it's really important to note that the primary source of embodied carbon emissions when you're looking at any building of a kind of multi-story nature is from the superstructure. It's around 45 to 50% of embodied carbon emissions for these types of building comes from the superstructure. So in order to have the greatest level of impact, we really need to change the structural material of our buildings or design those structures more efficiently. And timber, or mass timber specifically, represents a scalable solution that can be adopted on those mid to high rise buildings to massively reduce the embodied carbon impact of those buildings just by switching the structure to timber from concrete or steel. So really, we're looking to work with those developers and designers that are building that scale of building. And at that scale, it's quite a challenge at the moment to adopt timber for many reasons. So that's why I would come back to my original point that progress at the moment is limited. But I think we've made huge strides in the last year in building a consensus around what needs to happen. So as an example, one project that Built by Nature recently funded, which is looking to create a technical design guide for large commercial timber buildings, has brought together a group of 10 large private developers in the UK who've all co-funded the initiative. And as a group of brilliant designers that are then working on creating design guidance for these large commercial buildings and how we can do that out of timber in a way that mitigates the risks and achieves high quality levels of design and construction. And so this is a really real tangible example of how Built by Nature is having impact, because it looks to answer the primary challenges that we have in the UK that are preventing timber from being used, such as lack of available insurance at an affordable rate. That's one primary barrier. The second is a lack of consensus around fire safety and how to achieve it with timber in these large buildings. So what this project, the Commercial Timber Buildings Guidebook, aims to do is to build a consensus around what good fire safety practices look like for these large timber buildings, and also to engage with insurers through the initiative, through a series of roundtables, and to identify what the insurers' main concerns are, and then respond to these through the design guidance. So when the project is concluded in about a year, there'll be a tangible outcome. It will be a guidebook for designers and developers and insurers as well on how to safely build these large commercial buildings from timber, and how to do it in a way that mitigates the risks and concerns that all the stakeholders have. So it's really just about bringing everybody together, building consensus, and then formulating that into a kind of tangible outcome, such as a guidebook.
You've already started talking about the role of the timber in sustainable construction, and you even mentioned the challenges that we have to overcome. But Talking about the tall structures and the role that timber can play in those, would you say that it is about changing some of the elements in the tall towers, in the higher buildings to timber ones, or is it about not building tall buildings at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the taller you go, whatever the material, the higher impact you'll have in terms of carbon emissions generated by construction. And there seems to be a sweet spot from research that I have seen, somewhere between 10 to 15 stories. Once you go beyond that, whatever material you use, it requires you to have a more and more significant structure, which means that you are less and less efficient with your material use. So whether you're using concrete, steel, or timber, it really doesn't make that much sense to go much taller than 15 stories at the max. And I really just imagine this kind of city filled with 5 to 15 story timber residential developments. And I think that is really the kind of sweet spot.
When you said that it's around 50 stories high, I could just mention Copenhagen, which is a very good example of a city with this human scale, as many people may refer to Copenhagen. But also there are some towers appearing here in the city landscape. So it is interesting direction that city is taking. The question is it the right one or not? But my question also appeared because I remember seeing a LinkedIn post by you some time ago. And also, I think in this post, you referred to an interesting study, the environmental impact of tall versus small, a comparative study of the different typologies of the buildings and its environmental impact. So this is something that I would love to mention and add the link to it in the description, because I just found it extremely, extremely interesting.
Yes, exactly. I mean, as I mentioned before, really, no matter what building material you're using as the structural material, once you go above a certain height, it really doesn't make much sense, and it's diminishing returns, or actually more and more impact actually the higher you go. So I think keeping it livable, keeping it 10-story height kind of maximum, or not maximum, but kind of what we imagine our future cities looking like. I think that sweet spot of kind of mid-rise livable neighborhoods is really where we should be going. And I think it's probably worth mentioning a bit about why timber is so good for buildings that in that height range, actually, and why Built by Nature is focusing so much of our energy and resourcing on promoting timber versus other bio-based materials is really to do with the advances that we've had in timber product manufacturing over the past 2 decades. And it means that it's now technically possible to build increasingly large and complex buildings using timber as the primary structural material. So when we say timber buildings, what we're really referring to is buildings that use timber as the primary structural material. So we're using it as shorthand, really, when we say timber buildings. And I think that this is a really important point because of what I mentioned earlier about close to half of a building's embodied carbon footprint deriving from its superstructure. When we're thinking about those structural elements, now it is possible to use timber in a comparable way to how we're using concrete and steel, because we've got to a point with mass timber where the precision, the accuracy of the components, the efficiency that you can achieve through advanced manufacturing techniques to produce things like laminated veneer lumber out of beech hardwood, where you have incredibly precise, really compact, strong timber columns made from beech hardwood. So I think we've got to a point with timber where it's become possible to adopt mass timber for pretty much any building's structure. So because it's scalable, the product development has got to a point where the materials, the products can be used on buildings of that scale. There's a possibility for us to achieve a huge amount of impact by adopting mass timber across the sector.
Could you also say how could we overcome some of the barriers to timber construction? You've mentioned already the fire safety, for example, the legislation, or maybe the insurance that have to catch up. So what would you say that would be this cure for those challenges, and how can the timber construction face those challenges? Would the answer be that we should build only in wood?
I don't think that we should build only in wood, no. But I think it's important to frame that question specifically in an understanding of the scale of the climate crisis and what it necessitates. So we as a society have to get to zero carbon emissions as quickly as possible. And that means that we need to replace carbon intensive processes and materials with lower carbon alternatives wherever we can, if possible, to replace them with carbon storing alternatives as well. So wherever that is possible and wherever the technology exists already, we have to do it. And buildings are a clear example of where we can already have a massive impact, but just by changing practice in this way. So I wouldn't say that we only need to build in wood, but we should adopt a kind of hierarchy of measures, I think, to reduce the impact of construction. Firstly, we should be building less. We can achieve that by demolishing less and retrofitting more, using our existing built environment, our existing urban fabric as the starting point for any development. Secondly, something that I've mentioned before is that we need to design and build more efficient structures. So just, again, using less material overall. But then thirdly, and this is where timber comes in, it's about limiting our use of carbon-intensive products and materials. So things like concrete. We are always going to need to use concrete, but we need to focus its use into places where we really can't replace it. So below ground, substructure, infrastructure, that kind of thing. We're always going to need to use concrete for those types of use. And given that low carbon alternatives to concrete are at the moment a fairly scarce resource, we need to prioritize them for uses where we really can't use anything else. And timber can't be used in the ground, although Venice and Amsterdam famously have a lot of their buildings standing on timber piles. But
so far. But
yes, where timber is really good is above ground. And so kind of coming back to your question of should we only build in wood, I think that wherever we can replace concrete and steel above ground for the superstructure of buildings, we absolutely should. And then the other part of your question, I suppose, was then overcoming barriers to adoption of timber. And I've already mentioned some work on insurance, but we're doing some more work on overcoming the challenge of insurance for mass timber buildings. We have recently also funded a project called the Mass Timber Insurance Playbook, which is being led by the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And they have come up with a step-by-step guide for how to approach insurance for mass timber buildings. So the whole aim of that is to try and demystify the process of gaining insurance. What do insurers ask for? What do they look for? It's attempting to bring the insurance world and the design world closer together. And that's actually launching this week on Thursday, 4th of May. And the playbook itself will be available to download from the ASBP's website and from Built by Nature's too. So yeah, I think the way that Built by Nature approaches this is to, as I mentioned earlier, collectively identify those challenges within our networks and fund discrete solutions that aim to create kind of system-wide change. So anything that aims to overcome those challenges across the whole industry and create guidance and new frameworks that the whole industry can adopt. That's the kind of projects that we're interested in. Yeah. So I've mentioned a couple of on insurance. I think it's probably worth mentioning a couple of projects that we're funding on policy as well. I think it's kind of well documented that the policy environment across Europe in many places is currently designed for concrete and steel buildings. And many people within the industry cite the fact that we don't have policy that supports timber construction. Whilst we have intentions from governments from the UK and France and Netherlands and elsewhere across Europe, there is an intention to build more in timber. In some places, the policy environment does not currently support that. So a good example is in both the UK and in Ireland, actually, as well. We have fairly prohibitive regulations that prevent the use of timber in certain types of building. In the UK, it's in the external wall of residential buildings above 18 metres. So that's about 6 stories. So you can't use timber in the external wall of residential buildings above 6 stories. And in Ireland, it's even more restrictive than that. There are rules within the fire regulations that state you can't use timber in floors above 10 metres So that's even lower than 6 stories. So I think it's really a fact that we have a kind of prohibitive regulatory environment in places across Europe. But in some places, we have a much more supportive environment. And one of those is Amsterdam, where Built by Nature is headquartered. And we're doing work there with the city of Amsterdam to try and leverage the existing policy environment to increase timber in construction within the city. So we have a project called Circular, which is funded by Built by Nature, but being carried out by Dark Matter Labs, who are a kind of design and research studio in collaboration with the city of Amsterdam. And what they're doing is they're analysing the existing policy landscape in Amsterdam, and they're creating a tool to support civil servants or policymakers within the city to identify which policies and legislation already exists. So without having the need to create new policy, what exists already and how can those policies be leveraged to increase the use of timber? So it's really a tool for policymakers and city authority workers within Amsterdam to try and work together with the city to increase timber there. I think policy is going to be a key kind of challenge across Europe. We're also funding work by ECOS, and they are doing a kind of policy analysis across Europe, identifying what policies exist within EU legislative frameworks and how policy might be changed at the EU level to really increase the use of timber across Europe.
So it's about policy making and regulations and the discussion about those, as I understand. But coming back to my question, I hope that you found it as a rhetorical one about should we only build in wood? And I would like to twist it a bit, or actually maybe just turn this question around and ask, do we even should build in wood? And I mean here that one could argue that wood might be not such a sustainable resource in a way that it is limited in a sense that once you cut it for the construction, it will eventually grow again, but it will take a couple of decades. So maybe it's not within our lifespan that we see this tree being back on the planet. And I know that you also have something like forest stewardship and regeneration. So maybe you could just mention that while answering to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, when people ask this, I always come back to the kind of bigger picture. We need to be thinking in really long-term ways. And for me, the big picture with timber is this idea of creating a relationship between forests and cities that turns forests and cities into a kind of carbon pump. So through successive harvesting and replanting of forests and using those forest products in long lifespan uses within the built environment, such as structural applications, where the timber will be locked away in that building for the duration of that building's lifespan. Through successive harvesting and replanting and use of that biomass in the built environment, we can create this kind of forest to city carbon pump. And the potential impact of this is absolutely massive. And research by Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research has shown that by 2100, so by the end of this century, we could mitigate 100 billion tons of carbon emissions through the widespread adoption of timber in our cities. So for me, it's really thinking about this big picture. It's thinking about how we can forge a connection between our forests and our cities again. But this relies on sustainable forestry practices being in place. And if we examine what that means just for a second, so sustainable forestry is both about ensuring replanting so that there is a sustainable regrowth of forests, but it's also about ensuring that we have good biodiversity outcomes in forests as well. And sustainable forestry management is changing quite a lot and has changed quite a lot over the past few decades. And so what many of us think of when we think of commercial forestry are these kind of dark monoculture plantations where Sitka spruce trees have been planted in huge numbers about 30 to 40 years ago. These are the trees that are now reaching maturity and were planted decades ago when there was less awareness about sustainable forestry and what that really looked like. And practices have changed now, and biodiversity and social outcomes as well of forests are now given greater importance within forest certification. I think looking across Europe, we have had an increase in forest coverage over the past few decades. So looking at France as a specific example, forest coverage has increased by 9% since the 1990s, and it's increased across the whole of the EU. And it's partly the adoption of forest certification that ensures this. So programs like FSC and PEFC. And I think these are the mechanisms by which we can ensure sustainable forestry. And if we're now beginning to think more about biodiversity, species diversity, and how our forests can be truly sustainable places that are good for those biodiversity outcomes as well as carbon outcomes, then looking at certification schemes like FSC and PEFC is a really good place to really change the way that forestry is practiced. And Built by Nature's looking at this as well. And we're going to be funding a couple of initiatives very soon through something that was called the Built by Nature Challenge, which was published over winter. So it came out in kind of December 2022. And we were asking for proposals that looked to increase the visibility of forestry practices and the traceability of forest products right the way up the supply chain to the demand side, because we feel that there isn't much awareness at the moment within design and construction industries of what sustainable forestry actually looks like, what that means, and also, more importantly, how can you ensure that your products are resulting in sustainable forestry outcomes. So we're going to be announcing a couple of initiatives that we're funding across Europe that will be looking to increase the visibility of what that actually looks like and create better awareness and ultimately lead to more biodiversity and other kinds of environmental outcomes from our forests. So I think it's really important that we begin to look into greater detail into our forests, and really important to develop forest stewardship, as you mentioned.
That's why I brought up the topic, and also why I wanted to discuss about timber construction in this podcast, because I just find it pretty interesting topic myself, even though I don't know that much about it. And that's why this next question I have in my mind would be about maybe promoting and arguing for timber construction, because we've already, through this discussion, established some of the key negative aspects of wood, or maybe some threats of timber construction. So we've discussed the fire risk, which is one of the biggest concerns. We also discussed the durability. So maybe I'm also not a structural engineer, but about those wooden structures in the old buildings of Amsterdam or maybe Venice, I don't know how this would even work and for how long will it work, because it's wood just being in the water all the time. So the durability, and also above the ground as well, it's the second problem. The third would be the limited size, because you can't build over the 6 or 10 stories, as we already discussed, and the environmental impact when you basically use the timber as the resource. And while having those limitations that could be probably raised by a developer that you approach, what would be your answer while trying to advocate for the timber construction in the build industry?
Yeah, so you mean just to kind of talk a bit about the kind of benefits of timber and why exactly it's so good to use?
I would say especially what would be, in a way, your elevator pitch while you are approaching, it might be a developer or a city council, like you've mentioned in Amsterdam, or maybe an asset owner, investor. What would be your starting point in such a dialogue or discussion to kind of make them on board?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the primary reason why we use timber is because of what I call, or what many people call, the 3 S's. The first of these is about substituting. So substituting concrete and steel for for timber. The second of these is about sequestering. So the trees that grow to produce the timber products sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And the third S is about storage as well. So we really need to maximize that storage potential, talk about that storage potential in much greater detail, and to build that narrative around carbon storage and the possibility of carbon storage. So there's a really strong carbon case for timber that is both about substituting high carbon materials, but also sequestering and then storing carbon. But beyond carbon, there are many other co-benefits for timber. It really is quite a remarkable material or group of materials. It's lightweight, it's precise, it leads to shorter programs on site, it's quick to put together, quieter to put together as well. And particularly in urban environments, that can be a massive benefit, because if you're building in dense cities, you want to reduce disruption to existing communities and to neighbors of your development. So the fact that it's quieter is a massive benefit. You can prefabricate timber elements off-site in factories where you can ensure a higher level of precision, and these can be brought together and put together on site with incredible speed. It's incredibly durable stuff. You've already mentioned that there are kind of old timber structures kind of sitting in cities like Amsterdam and Venice. And I think that the reason that the timber foundations of Venice have lasted such a long time is actually to do with the process of calcification or mineralization. So because that timber is sat in a saline environment, I think it's there's a process that took place that effectively turned it into stone. But usually you don't really want to get your timber wet. And it's a really good principle to follow, that as long as you keep your timber dry, it will last forever. And we can see incredibly old churches and barns across Europe and Switzerland, Norway, and the UK, for example. There are buildings that are up to 1,000 years old with the original timbers still in place. So they are still storing that carbon that was sequestered by a tree 1,000 years ago. So as long as you keep it dry, it's incredibly durable. And finally, I think something that's becoming to be a bit more understood now are to do with the kind of biophilic benefits of timber. So timber, if used in an internal environment, in the fabric of a building, can contribute to better environments for people to be in. So it's commonly said that timber buildings increase well-being. And we actually wanted to do a bit of work that put some data to that. So DRMM, the architectural practice based in London, but also with an office in Berlin, approached us with a research proposal about a year ago to put together a series of case studies that highlight both the whole life carbon, but also the well-being, quality of life benefits of timber buildings. So they're doing some post-occupancy evaluation on 5 timber buildings around the UK at the moment, and they're attempting to put some data to this idea that timber buildings are better for you and create better environments. So that project will be concluding later this year, I think, and publishing kind of early next year. So hopefully you'll have a bit more data to back that idea up. But I think those are the main benefits of timber. Additionally, and one which is going to become much more of a talking point, I think, and already is in the UK, and perhaps it is in Denmark as well, are the qualities of fire resistance that timber has. And this is a really important point as we're looking to build higher quality and safer buildings, particularly in the wake of the Grenfell fire in the UK that was 6 years ago this year. Timber's fire-resisting qualities are becoming more and better known, but really the way that timber behaves in a fire is completely different to concrete and steel. And it's commonly cited that timber chars, and that the surface of the timber chars, and that this protects the timber below the charring layer. Whilst that is true, and whilst you can build in a bit of extra tolerance and create a bit of added structural depth to timber beams, and that will give you a kind of charring layer, I think we need to get to a point where more and more designers have an increasing level of competence in what fire safety in timber buildings really looks like, because actually the way that fire performs in a timber building is completely different to other more traditional kind of construction materials. So timber does have fire resisting qualities, but it's not accurate to say that it's fireproof or flame retardant or anything like that, which I do see written around sometimes.
So, as you said, there is a need for a bit more studies, and there is also work done by you, by Build by Nature. And I'm happy also to add the links to the open calls that you have and the initiatives that you also promote. And also, talking about the education, would you have any book recommendation around the topic?
Book recommendation? Yeah, well, something that I've just been reading is called The Manual of Biogenic House Sections. I'm bringing it up right now. It's by Paul Lewis, Mark Suramaki, and David J. Lewis. And it's an incredible compendium of architectural drawings of biogenic houses. So those are houses that are built with bio-based materials. It goes through timber, but also looks at straw and hemp and seaweed as well, and other bio-based materials. Has fantastic case studies. It's really well illustrated. It also talks you through how the materials are produced and what the construction details look like. So really, I think that this should be on every architect's desk, the Manual of Biogenic House Sections.
You can't say it because it's a podcast, but it also has a beautiful cover, and that's another advantage.
Yeah, it's a very well-designed book in like all throughout. I mean, the drawings that they've put in here are absolutely incredible. And if you're an architect like me, you'll find kind of perspective sections particularly attractive to look at, particularly when they're well inhabited and you see all sorts of detail in there. So this book has incredible perspective sections of loads of bio-based houses. It's really worth picking up.
I see that, and I can just confirm. I will just add the link as well in the episode description for those of you who are interested to get to know something more about it. And I will also invite you to Urban Future, because this is something that Build by Nature will be also present at. Could you say why is it worth both for the listeners but also for Build by Nature to attend Urban Future conference?
Yes, Build by Nature will be there. A couple of my colleagues will be there in Stuttgart at Urban Futures. And I think that it's really worth attending this event because we cannot solve the issues around climate change by ourselves. And we really need to connect more with people across the industry. So events like Urban Futures that bring together stakeholders from across the industry into knowledge sharing, action taking events are really, really important. It's really important to go along to these, to meet other people and to hear talks about what people are doing to address the challenges that we face.
And I hope to see Build by Nature there and your colleagues as well. And I think that was a very useful discussion for me, very useful lesson on timber construction. So I would like to thank you for that. And I'm actually, I need to say, eager to learn more.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode with Joe. And I hope that it helped you to understand the role of timber in the built industry and construction. This episode is made in a collaboration with Urban Future Conference and Laudas Foundation, and you will actually meet the Build by Nature network at the conference as well. If you would like to get something more about the conference, Build by Nature, or Laudas Foundation, please check the links in the episode's description. And I hope to see you in Stuttgart between the 21st and 23rd of June. See you soon.